All right, welcome back to University English 2, The Skills. And today we'll be looking at Unit 3, entitled Getting Along. Otherwise, it could be called How to be Formal and Polite in English. Now, first we're going to begin with an introduction, and then we'll look at the meaning of words like informal and semi-formal and formal, and how we can start moving from the informal towards the formal. And then we'll look at ways in which we can actually increase formality or be more polite, starting with the easiest ways. Polite words, how to deal with commands, make them politer, polite requests, polite offers, permissions, and a very common method for making things polite, which is embedding. And then we'll look at advice and invitations, criticism, problems and concessions, and how we can make all of those more polite. This will be followed by reducing the strength of opinions. And then we'll be looking at obligations, desires, and other methods of increasing the formality and politeness of what we are saying. Coming towards the end, we'll be looking at very formal language and how we can move towards very formal language and how we can improve our vocabulary. And then finally, we will sum up at the end. Let's begin with a quotation from Theodore Roosevelt as cited in the Joplin Globe in 1939. And he said, "The most important single ingredient in the formula of success is knowing how to get along with people." Now, in situations where people communicate with friends or family members, they tend to do so quite freely. And this kind of language that is used is often referred to as informal, not formal language. However, there are always situations where there is going to be a need to be politer. And this is sometimes referred to as semi-formal language. Now, formal language, which is or could be regarded as the politest forms of communication, is mostly reserved for writing, such as when you are writing academically or when you are writing at work, so your professional correspondence, for example, that is generally going to be what formal language is. Now, it's worth noting at this stage that there is no clear distinction between informal, semi-formal, and formal language. There is no specific point at which you can say you are now speaking semi-formally or formally. Rather, it's a graded scale. Now, failure to actually use politer forms of the language when it is appropriate to do so can result in the interpretation that you are being rude, you are being not polite or impolite. Perhaps they might think that you're unprofessional, or as a result of the language you're using, they might not like you, they might not respect you, and this will have knock-on effects or consequences on your relationships with other people, and these will then go on to damage your academic and working professional lives and also your personal prospects because of the damage that you're doing to relationships with other people. So it is very important to be able to speak politely when the times or the circumstances dictate that it is necessary. Now, unlike some other languages, Korean, for example, English does not have any inbuilt system which can be used to indicate levels of formality or politeness. You cannot simply change the endings of your verbs in order to be a little bit more polite or a lot more polite, as you can do with some languages. Instead, English uses specific structures and specific words in order to be more polite. And there are many methods of doing this. We can use politer words. We often use modal verbs or semi-modal verb forms. We might embed our sentences. We might embed our questions. And there are actually a variety of other ways as well in which we try to be more formal or more polite. Now, informal speech tends to be more direct and use simpler structures with fewer words. And this is simply because why use 1,000 words when two will do? So this is the kind of language you will use with your friends and with your family. However, you should always be careful of the language that you're using, even with friends or family members. For example, if one of my children said to me, "Daddy, give me some candy," then actually my reaction would be quite negative. I would likely not give my child some candy because they are not speaking politely. So even in informal situations, you might want to be a little bit more polite as much as you can. Now, to make structures more polite, we want to actually raise the level of formality to what can be referred to as semi-formal. And once again, there's not only one way of doing this, but there are many ways in which we can try to be more polite in English. So let's take a look at them, starting from perhaps the easiest and then moving through to more difficult methods. Now, by far, one of the easiest ways to make yourself more polite is to use polite words and polite expressions. So let's take a look here at some informal expressions which might be interpreted as being a little bit rude. For example, if you just say to somebody, "pass the salt," then maybe they're not going to like that. You can actually use some words like please, and when they do pass it, you can use words like thank you in order to make this actually much more polite. So instead, you could say, "pass the salt, please," and when they do, "thank you." Instead of saying no to somebody, you could say something like, "I'm afraid not." Instead of saying yes, you could say, "of course." If somebody is in your way, instead of just saying, "get out of my way," which might result in a fist fight, you could simply say, "excuse me." If you want somebody to wait, don't just say, "wait." You can say, "just a moment," and then add the magic word, "please." And we even tell our children, by the way, in countries where English is the native language, that please is the magic word because it makes things happen. So you should be adding please to many of your requests, if not all of your requests for things. So just a moment, please, is much better than wait. Move. Again, instead of just saying excuse me, you might say pardon me. If you make a mistake, don't just say oops and carry on. Apologize. I'm sorry. Another way to add formality is to include a title when addressing a person. And this is an easy way, again, that you can actually add a little bit of formality to what you want to say. So for a man, the expression Mr. dot is actually said as Mr. And here's an example. "Here is your order, Mr. Jones." For a woman, Ms. And it doesn't matter if the woman is married or not. You can just use Ms. and it sounds like a Z sound on the end for a woman. So there is a reservation for a Ms. Smith. Miss is an unmarried woman. So Miss Mary Clark is here to see you. Mrs. is a married woman. Mrs. Martinez is on line 2. Doctor would be a medical doctor or somebody who has a PhD or an advanced degree from university. So I have an appointment with Dr. Johnson. And professor, Professor Anderson gave a great lecture. Sir is just for any man. Would you like gravy with that, sir? And madam, it can be used for just any woman. So I'm sorry, madam, this is a no smoking area. Now note that some titles like Mr., Ms., Miss, and Mrs. should be used with family names, with your last names. Or you can use with first names and family names, but don't use them with only first names. So that the family name should always be included when you're using those four. Now, the other titles are quite useful actually because you don't actually necessarily need to know the names of the people that you're talking to. So, for example, if you meet your doctor, you can say, "Good morning, doctor." If you meet your professor, you can say, "Good morning, professor." You don't need to necessarily add the name to the title that you're using, which is quite useful if you don't know their name. In the same way, you can say, "Hello, sir," or "Hello, madam." Again, you don't need to necessarily know the names of the people. Now, it's especially the case that giving commands to people, which take the form of imperative structures, may be interpreted actually as being rude, unless there is a clear indication that somebody's status is beneath another person's, such as you would see in the military. For example, you'll often hear imperative structures being given as orders to junior officers or to enlisted men. Also, if you have a child, for example, it would be quite common to use imperative structures to order your own child around. But if you're trying to use these structures with your peers, people who are on a similar level as you, then this will be interpreted as being quite rude. Now, using polite words, expressions, and titles can actually help to improve the politeness. So, for example, if we have an imperative, a command, which is do 20 push-ups, well, we could try to make it more polite by adding the magic word, please. Do 20 push-ups, please. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the grammar here now. So you can see that there are color codings with these examples. Blue means that it's a verb. Green means that this is an object. And the purple means that this is an adverb. All right, so please is an adverb here. Now notice with an imperative structure, you'll see no red. And red is a subject in the color codings that we're using here for the examples. So in English, English is not a pro-drop language. Korean, for example, is a pro-drop language, meaning that the subject is often omitted or deleted when you are communicating with people. But in English, we invariably always keep the subject. We don't drop the subject in the structures when we are communicating. And the reason for this is that the subject is necessary. It's necessary because a process of inversion takes place when we make questions. So, for example, if I say, "Can you do 20 push-ups, please?" Notice that can is before you. But if I just want to use can, then I would say, "You can do 20 push-ups." So can has moved in that case. So the first verb, the finite verb, usually moves before the subject, except for when it is an unknown subject. And this is one of the few exceptions when we actually remove the subject. And why do we remove it? Well, because we don't need it. Because with imperatives, with commands or instructions, there are no questions. You're not asking somebody to something, you're telling them something. So imperatives don't have question structures. So you can see that a language will often delete or omit things when it's not necessary. But otherwise, it is necessary to keep actually the subject in English because of the process of inversion. So as we've seen, do 20 push-ups, please, might sound a little bit better than just do 20 push-ups, but alone, it's perhaps not enough to make this still not appear rude, unless, of course, you're in the army. So that's why we will use other structures to make it a little bit more polite. And in particular, we will use modal verbs rather than imperative structures if we want to be a little bit more polite. So in this case, you could use the modal verb shall. So you shall do 20 push-ups. Now, it does sound a little bit more polite as soon as you add a modal verb. Now, in addition, for even more politeness, commands can actually be turned into requests simply by converting them into questions using these modal verbs. Now, a request is where you ask someone to do something for you or perhaps to do something for somebody else. So on the left of the table at the bottom, you can see the orders, and these would be interpreted as being a little bit rude, unless, of course, you were in the military. And then we can turn them into an instruction with a modal verb, which is a little bit more polite. But if we want to be more polite, then we can start turning them into requests in question form. And we might even start adding the magic word in there too. So taking the example of no entry being an order, let's change that to a modal form. You shall not pass. And then let's make it a little bit more polite by changing it into a question. Can you not enter? Add the magic word, please. Can you not enter, please? Be quiet. Well, that's a little bit harsh. So let's make it a little bit more polite with a modal verb. Will you be quiet? And let's change it into a request with a modal. Could you please be quiet? Now notice that will you be quiet is actually a question structure already, but it would be interpreted as being an instruction in this circumstance. Let's take another example. Don't cheat. Okay, so you must not cheat. Now we have an instruction with a modal verb, and then we can change this into a request with a modal. Would you mind not cheating? Now, when using modal verbs, it's important to note that some modal verbs are interpreted as being slightly more polite than other modal verbs. So which modal verbs should you actually use? Well, once again, just changing it into a request with a modal verb is already making it more polite. So now we are talking about how do we make it even more polite? Which ones should we use to make it even more polite in these situations? So let's take a look at examples. So can is slightly less polite than could. And may and might would be interpreted as being really quite formal and quite polite in these circumstances. So here we have examples of personal requests. That means you're asking for something for yourself. So can I speak to Bob? Could I help you with that? May I have your name? Getting quite polite now. Might I take a seat? And then you could use requests for other people to do something, for example. So will you eat your greens? Can you give him the report? Could you give Jane my message? So could, again, being slightly more polite than can. Would you give her a call? So using would to make a request for somebody else to do something here. Now, as a general note, for modal verbs, pure modals, we have present tense and preterite or past tense forms. For example, can is the present and it's paired with the modal verb could, which is the preterite of can, the past tense form of can. Generally speaking, as you can see here, actually the past tense forms are more polite than the present tense forms. So will, for example, is present tense, and would is in fact past tense and they are a pair. So would is more polite than will. Now, modal verbs are also commonly used to make offers with varying degrees of politeness. So once again, some modal verbs would be interpreted as being slightly more polite than others. But all of these can be used for making offers for people. So can I get you a glass of water? You're offering to get them a glass. So shall I give her a message? You're offering to give her the message. Could she get your coat? May I take your order? Would they like some Coke? So all of these you're offering to do something. Now, another common function of modal verbs is to ask for permission to do things. Now, this is actually a similar function to offers, which are essentially akin to you asking permission to do something for somebody else, and also requests in that you are requesting to do something for yourself. The main distinction is that permission is generally being asked from somebody in a position of authority. For example, you might be asking a parent whether you can have some permission to do something, such as, can we please go to the playground? And note that you can add the magic word in there somewhere in order to make it even more polite. Or could we go to the movies, please? And you can use may and might as well. May we sing and dance? Might I interject? Now, embedded questions are often used to make questions more polite. And this is because a direct question can actually appear to be quite rude. Now, if you ask an embedded question, though, it can be much, much more polite. And in this case, we are using one clause, a full clause, which will have a subject and its predicate, which would include the finite verb at least. And we're going to use this actually as an object in another clause in which it's embedded. So this is then going to be a noun clause, because if it's an object, it must be a noun. So we're just going to use the whole clause as a noun. Now, when you are actually embedding an entire clause in this way, the usual subject-verb inversion, which I talked about earlier, is not going to actually occur. So if the original question begins with a verb, then this is a yes-no question, in which case you need to actually add if or whether to the start of the embedded clause. If is much more common than whether, by the way, because it's shorter. So let's take a look at a direct question. So if you go to Starbucks and you order a drink and you're waiting a long time, and then you say to the server there, the barista, where is my drink? Well, that could appear to be quite rude. So let's try and embed that. Could you please tell me where my drink is? So notice where my drink is a slightly different structure to where is my drink. And this is because the inversion where is has moved before the subject of my drink, which is usual for questions, is no longer occurring. So you need to move is back into the positive or affirmative position. So where my drink is becomes actually what you're embedding. And then could you tell me, let's add please, could you please tell me, and then the embedded clause, where my drink is. Can I leave a message? Well, it's okay. You're using a modal verb already, but let's make it doubly polite. So could I ask? Now notice that this question, can I leave a message, is beginning with a verb. And if it's beginning with a verb, then this is what we typically call a yes-no question, meaning the answer is either yes or no. You're not asking for information. Where is my drink is asking for information, and you cannot respond really with yes, no. Where is my drink? No, makes no sense. Can I leave a message? Yes, you can. No, you can't. One or the other. But let's try and make it a little bit more polite. Could I ask if I can leave a message? So because it's a yes/no question, we need to add if at the start of the embedded clause, if or whether. Once again, if being more common. Could I ask if, and then change the structure again? I can leave a message. Now, there are many expressions which you can use actually to embed questions. Some of these are in question format themselves, and others are not. Now, it doesn't really matter whether they're in question format themselves or not, unless you're writing. Because if you're writing, if it's beginning with a question, you need to put a question mark at the end. But if it's beginning with a questioning statement, then you don't need to put a question mark at the end. You just put a full stop. But let's imagine then that you want to ask the question, are you happy? Now, are you happy is a yes/no question because it's beginning with a verb. So we need to add if or whether. I'm going to choose to add if. And we need to change the structure. So it becomes, are you happy will become if you are happy. If you are happy. So there are many possible ways you can embed this. Can I inquire about if you are happy? Can you let me know if you are happy? Can you tell me if you are happy? Could I ask if you are happy? Could I check if you are happy? Could you tell me if you're happy? Do you happen to know if you're happy? Do you have any idea if you are happy? Do you know if you are happy? Do you mind telling me if you are happy? Do you remember if you are happy? Who can tell me if you're happy? Who knows if you're happy? Would you happen to know if you're happy? Would you mind explaining if you're happy? Would you tell me if you're happy? And then you've got questioning statements, which are not actually in question form, but it would be interpreted as being a question. So I was wondering if you are happy. I wonder if you're happy. I would like to ask if you're happy. I would like to know if you're happy. Now, notice that we can actually use these embedded noun clauses with not just questions, but with other kinds of statements, with affirmative or positive statements, and with negative statements or disaffirmative statements as well. So here you have some examples of that. So if the person doesn't know, then he might answer, I don't know if I am happy. I have no idea if I am happy. I'm not sure if I'm happy. Now, where the embedding method employs a question, remember again that you need to put a question mark at the end, but with a questioning statement, you don't actually need to put a question mark. But when speaking, it would be interpreted as being a question. So once again, noun clause objects can be easily used for non-question structures like uncertainty statements. So here's another example. So person A says, do you know where Mr. Smith is? And then the other person answers, I'm not sure where Mr. Smith is. I wonder whether you should call him. So here this is being used as a suggestion. So that the person wants to say that you should call him. So I wonder whether you should call him. Now we can give our views as to the desirability of an action using modal verbs. And this is advice. We can also use some of these structures for invitations as well. Now, here we're now starting to look at how strong or how weak your statement is. Stronger statements would be imperatives. For example, you're ordering somebody to do it. It's a very strong statement. And stronger statements tend to be interpreted as being ruder or more impolite than actually weaker statements. So where possible, we perhaps want to try to weaken the statements. Now, advice indicates whether we think something is a good idea or not, quite simply. And you can actually use varying degrees of strength to make these suggestions. So let's take a look at some examples. So very strong suggestion, very strong advice, come to the party. Must is quite a strong modal verb, so you must come to the ball. And you can use these only for questions really with will when it comes to an invitation. Will you come to my party? Let's use should. Now, should is very commonly used for advice, so meaning good idea or bad idea. You should think about it. For questions only, you might use shall. What shall we do? We could see the movie tomorrow. You might want to meet him. And notice this is actually a double modal here. You might want to meet him. So yeah, these forms can also be used for invitations. Once again, we're talking now about how strong or how weak it is. So stronger forms are more direct, and because they're more direct, they're going to be less polite. Weaker forms are, in fact, going to be more polite. Now, whereas advice is more present or future oriented, criticism actually can be leveled in all different kinds of time frames. So here we are actually giving a negative view. We think it's not such a good thing what you've done. So we're giving a negative view of a past, present, or future act, choice, or decision, while possibly indicating the consequences of that bad choice or decision. Now, criticism can be made with modal verbs, but you can also use non-modal structures. But once again, non-modal structures tend to be more direct, and as a result, they're more direct, they're stronger, and then they're less polite. So let's take a look at some criticism. So talking about the present time, so present tense here. So he always fails tests. So the addition of the always here is indicating that this is criticism. And then he will fail the test again. Consequence. Right? They sing that song can be used for questions only. She might have called. Past can be used only for the past. And a lot of that would be the way you say it as well. Because if you say she might have called, that might be interpreted as meaning I don't know if she called or not. But if you know that she did not call and you want to criticize that, then you would say she might have called, meaning you wish that she had called. It was rude for her not to call. You could study harder, present tense, meaning it's a good idea for you to study, please. And then you could have studied harder. This would be a perfect modal, talking about an unreal or unrealized past, criticizing that past, meaning you failed your test, for example. You could have studied harder, but you were too busy partying. Now, while criticism is generally reserved for people, we often have problems with things. We do have problems with people as well, but then we can criticize them. But with things, we tend to have problems that we want to talk about as well. And we can use non-modal structures to present a problem. We can also use will not, won't for short, and would not or wouldn't for short. So for a problem in the past, you might say it didn't work, for example. So that's not a modal structure. You're just stating that it didn't work. If it's the present, if it's not working now, then you would probably use progressive or continuous aspect. So it's not working. There are alternatives, of course. So it wouldn't work could be used for a past problem. And for a present problem, you might just say it won't turn on. Both of those using a modal structure rather than a structure without a modal verb. Now, to admit a mistaken opinion or a mistaken action, we can also use modality to lessen the degree or the strength of the admission. Now, these are typically either present admissions or past concessions. So let's take a look at some past concessions first. So you might, and this would be a very strong admission of fault. So you might just say, I was wrong. If you wanted to weaken your guilt, then you might use something like you may have been correct, or they might have had a point. For present admissions, then, well, you would probably use present form. So rather than the past with the perfect modals there, you would use, in this case, just a simple modal or no modal at all. I'm wrong. And then with modals, they may be correct, or you might have a point. So present admissions there. Now, as you've seen, reducing the strength of opinions, of criticisms or advice is a very good way of actually being less direct, less strong, and as a result, less rude with people. So how do we actually go about doing this? Well, let's say you should eat less or you will gain weight. Now, already this is actually politer than an imperative structure. So with an imperative, you would just say, eat less or you'll get fat, which is not very polite. So rather than using an imperative structure, we're using a modal verb. You should. Modal should is often used for advice. So you should eat less or you will gain weight. So it is already actually quite polite, but how can we make it actually politer even? Well, we can further weaken these structures by adding words like maybe, possibly, and perhaps. And also, instead of using forms which indicate greater surety of things, we can use forms which indicate less surety. So let's look at some examples of how we can make this statement more polite then. So let's add perhaps. Perhaps you should eat less, or you may gain weight. So notice will has high surety, meaning, and it's difficult to quantify the exact percent, but it means that maybe 90% sure, whereas may or might are much less surety, maybe 50% if you want to quantify it in that way. So instead of using will, which is near guaranteed, you're going to use may or might to weaken actually the degree of surety as well. So perhaps you should eat less or you may gain weight. Let's try maybe. Maybe you should eat less or you might gain weight. So might being used there as well in place of may. You might want to eat less or you could possibly gain weight. Now notice here, want to is actually a form which indicates desire. So here we're going to add might to it to make it a suggestion, a politer suggestion. So being used in place of should. So you might want to eat and then a to infinitive as the object of the verb want, less, or you could possibly gain weight. Now, another way to mitigate opinions is to embed them in the same way as we would with embedded questions. So remember that I mentioned that we can use embedding for many things, actually. Well, here's one of the things that we do use it for, in particular to weaken opinions in order to make them more polite. So for the example here, you shouldn't go. Well, let's imagine that you're going to a party. I think it's a bad idea. I'm going to say you shouldn't go. But let's make it a little bit more polite. I'm going to use the expression I think, which is one of the most commonly used expressions when you give an opinion in order to embed a statement. So I think you shouldn't go. And that is optional here. So you can add it if you want. I think that you shouldn't go. There are many of these expressions. I think is the most common, and you could probably get away with using just that. But there are other options. So let's take a look at the examples. That, if it's in brackets, means it's optional. You can use it or not. So we have the stronger opinion, you shouldn't go. I think you shouldn't go. Let's have the strong opinion, it's a good idea. Well, we want to weaken it so that we don't say it's such a good idea. We want it to be a little bit less of a good idea. So I guess that it is a good idea. You should call her. Let's weaken that a little bit. In my opinion, you should call her. Calling is a good plan. Let's use I believe. I believe calling is a good plan. I believe that calling is a good plan. That is not the best idea. I feel that this is not the best idea. We should work. I would say that we should work. We should act. From my perspective, we should act. She is better off. In my point of view, she is better off. So you can use any of those expressions to embed in order to weaken the strength of your opinions. And people tend to be quite opinionated. We have very strong opinions, so try to weaken them in order to be a little bit more polite. Now, there are several forms which can be used to indicate necessities or obligations. Some can be used for the present, which would by implication mean the future as well, in addition to past times. So remember that in English we have two tenses. We have present and past. Present tense means not finished. Past tense means finished. Well, that's the basic meaning of the two. So present tense forms are used for the future as well, because the future is not finished, hasn't started yet. So let's take a look. Past obligations. We had to finish it. We had an obligation to do that. In the present, that would be we have to finish it. I needed to read the book. So present obligation, I need to read this book. There are other present forms that we can use for present obligations, but not for past. So have got is used for present, but not past. And must is not used for the past in this way. So we must be home soon. That would be a present obligation. And then they have got to come, a present obligation there. Now, desires are things we wish to have or see done. And rather unsurprisingly, want is actually a very commonly used verb when it comes to desires. However, it is worth noting that would like is considered a much politer structure, and in most cases should replace want, particularly in professional contexts when you're asking questions. So, for example, instead of saying, "Do you want to leave a message?" Well, that could be interpreted as being quite rude, so let's use the would like structure instead. Would you like to leave a message? There are other examples here. So for past desires, I wanted pizza. Present desires, I want pizza for dinner. Well, okay, let's make that more polite. So we would have liked pizza, a perfect modal there for the past. And then we would like pizza. They wanted to sing and dance. They want to sing and dance would be present. Both of those not incredibly polite. We can replace them with would like structures. I would like to have spoken to Bob. I would like to speak to Bob. And of course, always add the magic word whenever you can, please. And that makes things much, much more polite. Now, there are actually other ways in which we can make ourselves more formal or more polite. Bear in mind that all of these methods and the other methods are cumulative, meaning you can use them in combination. So use the magic word, please. Use other polite expressions and words. Use titles. Embed your questions and do other things as well, these other things, and you're essentially just layering in more and more politeness to what you're saying. But let's take a look at these other methods that we use in English to make things more polite. So often, and you probably remember when I mentioned this with the modal verbs, past forms are more polite than present forms. So we can actually change present to past in certain circumstances and make it more polite. So let's say somebody tells you their name and you miss what the name is. You might say, sorry, what is your name? Okay, so let's make that a little bit more polite and let's use the past tense of is, which is was. Sorry, what was your name? Simple to progressive. So progressive is one of the two aspects we have in English, progressive and perfect. Progressive is the action form. You'll be using the be verb with ing added in there in some form. So for the original, I will send it later. Okay, a little bit more polite. Let's add the be verb and ing. I will be sending it later. Now we can actually do both of those together. Again, you can layer these things in, and we might as well embed it while we're at it. So here we have, I wonder if you like it. So it's already embedded. The original question was, do you like it? And now we've changed that to an embedded question. I wonder if you like it. But we want to make it even more polite. So instead of I wonder, which is present, why don't we make it past? And why don't we actually make it progressive as well, the action form? So I was wondering. And then for like, we can even change that into the past. I was wondering if you liked it. Now, this is another common method that we use now, changing an active sentence to a passive sentence. And this is very useful because often we don't want to actually indicate the guilt of an action. And we can do that by actually taking away the subject and replacing it with an object, for example. So here, you made a mistake. So a mistake is the object. If I just say you made the mistake, well, it's going to make the person feel terrible. So why do that, especially if it's not actually necessary? Let's just change a mistake to the subject position and get rid of you. So then a mistake was made. Now, when it comes to changing active to passive, we're not going to go into the full details here, but you're adding the be verb in the same form as the verb that you are changing into the passive, and then moving the verb that you're replacing it with to the right and changing that to a past participle. So, for example, made is simple past. So we need to use past tense of the be verb in its place, which is was. So a mistake was, and then the past participle, make, made is made. So we put made to the right of that as the past participle. A mistake was made. Now we can also do active to passive, and we can embed it as well. So you broke the cup. Well, okay, we don't want to put too much blame on you here. So, well, why don't we embed it, move the cup to the subject position. So it seems, so that's the embedded phrase here, the cup was broken. Break, broke, broken. So add the be verb in the past tense because it's a past form you're using here. And then we use the past participle on the right of that. Now, also, we often use negative questions to be a little bit more polite. So instead of saying to somebody, do I know you? We might make a negative question. And that's a negatives most commonly use the adverb not to make them negative. So don't I know you, or do I not know you? And we can also use negative questions where we are changing a statement to a negative question. So, for example, here, we should act now is a statement. So let's change that to a question. And let's change that not just to a question, but to a negative question to make it more polite. So instead of saying, we should act now, should we act now would sound too much like a question. So shouldn't we act now? That sounds like a suggestion. Now, all of that can be considered really to be semi-formal communication. So what is the difference then between semi-formal, which is simply slightly politer English, and formal language? Well, formal language is that language which is commonly used in academic writing and in professional written correspondences. So, for example, if you're sending an email at work or writing a letter, or you're writing some kind of communique to somebody, which is going to happen a lot at work, in particular, then all of these should actually be using formal language. How do we move towards formal language? Well, all of the methods that we've already covered for turning informal language into slightly politer, semi-formal language are used. But also here, the most important thing, or one of the most important things, is the choice of words and the choice of the form of these words. So typically, for formal language, less common words are used, and contractions, which are where you will omit letters and join them together, such as don't or haven't or couldn't. We generally don't use these contractions. All right, try to avoid them. So let's look at a couple of examples. So you come home from shopping, you tell your mum, there, we bought some stuff. Well, that's absolutely fine, informally. But how, if you're actually going to write a similar message at work, would you go about doing that? Well, we could do a couple of things. So first, we're going to change the active to a passive. And we're going to change the words that we're using. So stuff is not an appropriate word for formal language. So instead of stuff, I'm going to use a number of items. And also, instead of the verb buy, which is bought here because it's the past, instead of the verb buy, I'm going to use the verb purchase, which is slightly more formal. And we are going to put this structure together. So then a number of items were purchased. Now here's another example. Hasn't the shipment arrived? Okay, let's embed it. And let's use deliver as well. So I wonder if the shipment hasn't been delivered. Now, adopting formal language is therefore really a combination of knowing how to create these semi-formal polite structures, whilst at the same time being in possession of more appropriate formal vocabulary. Now, vocabulary is very important for learning a language, and this has been recognized for quite some time, and there's been a lot of work which has been conducted in relation to vocabulary. Now, one of the significant milestones was when the General Service List was produced by West in 1953, and this provided a list of the most commonly used vocabulary for everyday life. And this was followed by the Academic Word List, which was produced by Coxhead in 2000, which created a list of the most common words used academically. And these are words that are going to be used then in more formal situations, because remember that academic language is one of the situations where we actually use formal language. Now, these lists have actually more recently been updated by Doctors Charles Brown, Brent Culligan, and Joseph Phillips, which led to the creation of the new General Service List and also the new Academic Word List as well. So these are the most up-to-date lists that you should be using for general vocabulary development. And in this case, when we're talking about formal language, the new Academic Word List would be very useful for developing these words that you need to know if you want to write more formally. Now, obviously, in relation to vocabulary, this is one of the most difficult parts of learning a language. It takes a long time to memorize all of these words, but if you make the effort, you can easily expand your vocabulary in these areas. Just as a side note, there are many other lists that Charles Brown and Brent Culligan have actually gone on to develop since that time. So there is the TOEIC service list, the business service list, the new Dolch list, which is for younger learners, and they've even created the fitness English list for sports or sports or fitness fields. And there's their new general service list for spoken language. The general service list itself being for spoken and written, but here we have one which is just for spoken language. So where do you get these lists? Well, go to newgeneralservicelist.org and you can actually just download all of these lists along with a bunch of tools there as well for teaching the lists if you're interested. Now, while you can actually do that, it'll take you a little bit of time to obviously develop your academic vocabulary and your more formal vocabulary. So in the meantime, I've put up a few words here which would help in formal situations for you to sound more formal if you started perhaps with these words. So from less formal on the left to more formal on the right, instead of using a lot of, if you want to make that more formal, then a great deal of. Instead of using about, regarding. Instead of using after, use thereafter. Instead of using also, moreover. Instead of answer, use respond. Instead of ask for, request. At first, initially. Better, superior. And we saw this in the example. Instead of buy, use the verb purchase. Cheap, nah. Inexpensive. Drink, refer to it as a beverage. Instead of live, I reside. Lively, animated. Need, require. Next, subsequently. Now, immediately. Okay, acceptable. Old, elderly. People, this is an unusual one, but you probably remember in your early days of learning English that there is one person and two people, and there is no such thing as persons. But actually, in very formal contexts, we do use the word persons, but only when we are writing, again, in a very formal context. Seem, you can use appear. Show, you can use demonstrate. Instead of saying so, you could say consequently. Instead of eat, you could say consume. Instead of end, complete. Instead of enough, sufficient. Instead of fix, repair. Instead of get, acquire. Instead of help, assist. Instead of home, residence. Instead of in the end, ultimately. Instead of kind of, somewhat. Instead of leave, let's depart. Instead of let, permit. Instead of start again, resume. Instead of start, you can say commence. Instead of stop, cease. Instead of sweat even, you can say perspire. Instead of tell, inform. Instead of try, attempt. Instead of watch, observe. Instead of whole, use entire. For work, use function. Don't say you're wrong, say you are incorrect. And also try not to refer to people in second person. So you did this, you did that. It's perhaps better to use one. One may feel that this is not the right course of action. That way you're not directly pointing at people, which is again one of the reasons why we use passive structures a lot. Let's summarize. To start out, if you want to be polite, it can be as easy really as using a few simple words. In particular, the magic word please when you're asking for anything, and thank you when you have it. So make sure that you add please and thank you to your structures when you're requesting things and getting them. Titles are commonly used also to show respect. You can use titles like Mr. or Ms. and then the family name for men and women. If you can't remember people's names, Professor, Doctor, Sir, Madam can be used as well. Modal verbs are the main means by which we politely make requests and offers, how we ask for permission, how we indicate our desires, we give advice, invite, indicate problems, offer criticisms, make concessions, and indicate obligations. So modal verbs are the ways in which we politely do all of these things. Note that it is common when asking questions to embed your question for extra formality and extra politeness. And you can choose one expression if you can't remember all of them. So could I ask, or I was wondering, and then get in the habit of embedding questions after that. Now, when you're giving opinions, embedding is also used alongside other words like possibly, perhaps, or maybe to weaken the strength of the opinion. Remember that a stronger opinion is more direct and more rude, and a weaker opinion is going to be interpreted as being more polite, and likely it's going to have a better chance of being received well. Other methods, such as passive structures, are also used to make yourself more polite. Remember again that all these methods can be combined together. It's not there, and there are no distinct levels as such. You are simply layering on more and more formality and more politeness. If it comes to very formal language, which is typically reserved for writing, this is going to require improved academic vocabulary, and you're going to need to actually work on your vocabulary. But you could make a start by perhaps learning some of the more formal word examples that were given. And that ends how you can be polite to people in English. Thank you once again for your time.